And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great to have on today Corey Miller from Ratio Christi. Corey, how are you today?
Doing just great. It's a bright sunny day and it's starting to warm up. So thank you for inviting me on.
Absolutely. And I think finally spring could be here, as we both live in Indiana, and sometimes our weather here is schizophrenic. And so it'd be nice if like spring would just come and stay. Well, looking forward to having you come on and talk about your ministry in the university space, and then more broadly about apologetics and evangelism. We're in a very quickly changing culture, so looking forward to kind of tapping your thoughts and your experience in that. Well, if you would jump in, you are the president and CEO of Ratio Christi. You hold a master's degree in philosophy, biblical studies, and just because you were bored in philosophy of religion and ethics, right?
Right.
So well studied. Previously in the Mormon faith, became a Christian author as well. So I'll let you kind of jump in and share a little bit about your background, but then also the nuts and bolts of Ratio Christi, I think one of the kind of premier college ministries in the United States and really abroad as well.
Yeah. And I have a doctorate in philosophical theology as well. I just wanted to mention that because our ministry, we do have a highly educated ministry, but we do not think of ourselves as Mr. Spock or fatheads. We say we have two ears and one mouth for a reason, so that we listen more if someone wants a hug. We give them a hug if they need an argument. We're the ministry on campus to give them an argument. And Ratio Christi means the reason of Christ. It's on 150 campuses from Canada to South Africa. We have a professor's ministry, a high school ministry, and then our core university student ministry, equipping students and professors with historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Jesus. And we've been around for just over 10 years and having some good and rapid growth, but seeing a lot of people come to know Jesus and also getting our hands involved in the legal sphere, and not intentionally. That's not how we started out, but sure. Increasingly so.
So 10 years, I did not realize it had such a short history. Did you found it, or what was the impetus for starting the ministry?
Yeah, no, the ministry started at App State, where some students just said, look, there's no apologetics here. There's no good answers. And frankly, unfortunately, in some of the churches, a lot of people feel like they can't get the answers. So they went to a nearby seminary in North Carolina, and together they partnered, and some people from that seminary and those students started it, and it just started to rapidly expand to Texas A&M and to Oklahoma and Florida and other places around the nation. It got its first president a few years later. He has since passed away, and I came on board about 6+ years ago. Just after I finished my second attempt. I'm one of the dumb ones. It took me 2 attempts. After the second attempt to get the PhD, 2 months later, this role opened up, and I thought, wow, this is hand in glove. I love it.
We have a remarkable personal testimony. So I wanted to hear a little bit about how I believe you were raised as a Mormon and then came to Christ and have written a number of books. But then also a little bit, you mentioned to me earlier, a little bit about your academic journey and how being a Bible-believing Christian, that came with some challenges. So if you wouldn't mind sharing just briefly about those two things.
Yeah, I was a seventh-generation Mormon. My great-great-great-grandfather was one of Joseph Smith's bodyguards. And the very first sect that split away from Mormonism was his father. So that's my seventh gen. The sixth gen went with Joseph Smith. The seventh gen went with the first defecting group because one of Joseph Smith's first and second counselors, his second counselor, William Law, was a man that Joseph Smith tried to get his wife assigned to him. Joseph Smith was assigning many men's wives to himself in the hereafter, but he started getting a little more aggressive and was actually running for the president of the United States at the time too. And so it was accumulating not just this huge militia that was 2/3 the size of the U.S. Army at the time and almost went to war with them, but started threatening other communities in the area. And they were pretty scared about this. And so I go into this, and I've got 2 books on this: Leaving Mormonism, Why 4 Scholars Changed Their Minds, and then another one on reaching out to Mormons. And then I've got a third one we're working on right now, hopefully published later this year. But it was that kind of woke me up to truth. I had a 0.3 at one point in my GPA, and I never had a knack for knowledge. And it was when I realized that Mormonism was false, it woke me up and said, wow, well, how do I know this new conversion experience that I just had at a Christian camp that I attended in California, simply so I could get the whole summer and spend at the beach? The guy's father said, you got to go to this camp. I'll pay for it. And when I was there, they spoke on hell. I tell people that scared the hell out of me and heaven into me.
Yeah.
But it changed my life. I moved back to California with that family for my junior year of high school. And that's where I first started seeing a Christian family and a vision for the future. Went back my senior year of high school to Utah to graduate. And that's when things really got heavy. And I started to have to read through the Book of Mormon once again for the sake of truth and not tradition. Found it to be wondered about the Bible also because I'd always believed that was, chock full of holes, but it didn't matter because you had a living prophet. But now I don't have a living prophet anymore either. So how do I know the Bible is God's word? How do I know it's even reliable? How do I know God even exists? And if so, which God? So that sent me into this trajectory of philosophy and comparative religions, and it's become an addiction that I've never been able to get rid of. And I went into pastoral ministry for a while, was a professor for a while, and now I've been a president for a while of a parachurch ministry, PPPPP.
Wow. And it's a really broad experience there. And I love the fact that, well, you've been in academia, but also I think having that pastoral experience is helpful, especially if you're ministering to professors and students, because that kind of boots on the ground, making disciples is important work.
Yeah.
You did describe a little bit I think the need, and perhaps one of the reasons why your organization has spread as quickly as it has is probably very apparent. I mean, most Christians don't have to be taught that especially higher education at times can be difficult for Christian students as they're heading in there.
Yeah.
But I think you even had some personal experiences with, holding to scripture, and as certainly the biblical sexual ethic, that came with some scrutiny. So to whatever level you might be comfortable sharing some of that, I think it'd be helpful perspective as we jump into the rest.
Sure. I mean, this was almost my first experience in college at Salt Lake Community College, where I was presenting a Christian perspective, and the professor kicked me out of the classroom for the semester and flunked me. And I ended up calling a legal organization and went legal in class number 1. The president put me back in the classroom, forced the professor to let me back in, and I got an A for the semester as long as I shut up. That's all I did. But as an undergrad student, then as a professor, I had a former student, or a student of mine who was a former pastor who turned gay. And I always use textbooks that are my opposition. Almost always they're atheist authors, and notable atheist authors as well, so that it gives me an opportunity to have equal airtime at some juncture. And they don't think that I'm biasing anything. If anything, I'm biasing it against my viewpoint. And this student, when we got to the sexual aspect of ethics, called me a homophobe, charged me with creating a suicidal environment, played the victim card, and I ended up having 2 students in my class who were atheists who took my defense and forced the university to actually listen to my lectures, which they had recorded. Or they said, if you punish him without even listening to his lectures, even though we don't agree with his views, he didn't do anything wrong. And if you punish him, this is not free thinking, and we're not staying at this school. We're going to go to a school down the road. And so Alliance Defending Freedom helped out and stepped in pro bono as well. I got exonerated for that, and then faced off as a grad student at Purdue University, where I was told I had too much of a faith perspective in my 5th year when I was 1 year out from graduating, all but dissertation. But they had me on that one. I had no legal recourse. You can force a professor to publish or perish, but you can't force them to be on a committee with a grad student. They can choose to or not to, and the waters got soiled in that case, and I could not find anyone in the department who would chair my committee, even though I still had a full committee, and I was a year out from graduating. So I had to terminate with a 5-year master's degree, and that's what made me go, wow, this is this is far more hostile than I had ever realized as a pastor in my past life, and looking at so many of my students who had gone off to the university and what I had faced off with. And so I wanted to know who was going after professors, who was reaching professors. And at the time, it was Campus Crusade and InterVarsity, and I joined one of them and continued on with the PhD in the second attempt, finalized that, and 2 months later came on staff as the president with Ratio Christi.
There's so much there, and we often talk about the classic form of liberalism and the idea of free speech, and that was the impetus behind institutions of higher education. And then to hear stories like yours,
Right.
and
Yeah.
I wish I could say that this was, the first time, and we're all really surprised that occurred, but unfortunately that keeps happening time and time again, as our idea of free speech, and I think the value we place on that principle seems to be eroding. And something I didn't mention in your bio is that you've taught, I think, over 100 college classes, and so you've had that experience, and it was in that context as a teacher that occurred. Well, with kind of that foundation laid, as here's the reason for the ministry, kind of your background, any kind of recent success stories or ministry developments? It sounds like you've had just kind of explosive growth there, but anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, since you're an attorney, also, again, we've had 3 legal federal court victories, finishing up our 4th one now. We contributed to a Supreme Court victory last year, and we are in litigation with the Biden administration's Department of Education right now. So we defend the faith, but also defend the ability to defend the faith, because it does no one any good if we're 10 miles off campus. We can't give the purity of the gospel. We don't have a bullhorn that loud. So that's one. We've found this thing called the U.S. Constitution to be rather helpful in giving university administrators a continuing education when they need it.
Yeah.
But as far as our main mission, last semester we had 40 or 50 students on one campus alone come to know Jesus. And that's through the use of apologetics evangelism. We try to generate more light than heat. In our conversations, we do a conversational approach, and a lot of the members of our clubs, the one down in Indianapolis, for example, the most vocal supporters of the club are both atheists. They've actually helped that club raise funds for the club. So we get some really good congenial environments in our clubs. We partner with human sex trafficking organizations and talk about the goodness of Christianity, then do a debate right after that on God and morality, which one makes the most sense of this. Or we'll partner with adoption agencies or something like Compassion International, do the same thing. I'll be doing that. I just did it at Purdue University. I'll be doing it at Winthrop in North South Carolina next month. We've got it happening this month at University of Nebraska. So it's not just about having these highfalutin debates, but making the Christian God plausible, showing how Christianity is not just true, but it's good for the world. So I think people coming to Christ is one thing, keeping the legal doors their ministries want to play God and never get their hands dirty with legality. They might ask, what would Jesus do? We say, look, there are certain things you shouldn't ask that for, because if so, I wouldn't be a parent, because let's just be frank, I've had intercourse, and Jesus would never do that unless he was the Mormon Jesus. But what would Paul do? Well, he would litigate the heck out of people for his Roman citizenship. And we've taken that number and kept the door open for many other ministries other than ourselves in that regard. We're working on something similar to the Blackstone Legal Fellowship right now in terms of getting solid Christian attorneys into key places, from courts to firms. And this is called the Malik Academic Fellowship that we've just begun. And we're launching a movement of funded missional professors. Rather than professors who happen to be Christians, we want people to be Christian professors, missional professors, and we want to train them up when they're young so that when they would get older, they will not depart from it for the next 40 years of their career.
And one of the reasons I was looking forward to interviewing you is you bring that kind of relational, conversational piece. You then talk about evangelism and apologetics, but then also mindful that while doing this work, there are those that oppose the biblical worldview, that oppose that moving forward. Unfortunately, that is the case. And so at times, just like Paul used his Roman civitas, as you mentioned, and one of my favorite stories there in Acts 16, where he's like, he kind of pulls that out and everybody's like, oh no, you're a citizen. He wasn't afraid to use that. And therefore we use the law as a tool as well. And so again, just kind of that well-rounded approach there. Well, as we kind of jump into this, what, just from your experience, of course, we see the stats, and even on your website, the stat about something like 75% of students leave their faith behind at college. So do you have any, and I think a well-known stat, well-known paradigm, but do you have maybe some more nuts and bolts on why that happens? So of course, the party scene, maybe a hostile environment to faith,
Yeah.
but any more specifics as thoughtful Christians, why that's happening?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. You mentioned the party scene, so you have frat row or sorority row, and on Friday nights when everybody's doing it, now you're away from your youth, you're away from your comfortable Christian environment, and now you're alone, and everyone's doing it, and there's that temptation, but you're holding back. But over time, you're in all of these classrooms where ideas have consequences, whether it's from biology or economics, philosophy or psychology. The Christian faith is getting obliterated from the PhDs who have the lectern, and they're viewed as the smart guys. And because of the radically disproportionate number, I mean, if there is any place where Christians are the non-privileged, the anti-privileged group, it's in the academy, where the professor left to right is 12 to 1 for those retiring and 23 to 1 for those who are ages under 40 and have 30 years ahead of them to teach. 23 to 1. I mean, the pastor and the parent can't really compete with that. And so Friday night comes along, and Johnny has now just gone through, 8 of his classes over 8 weeks, and he's thinking this bucket doesn't hold any water anymore. I learned on both knees that there was Santa and there was God. I figured the first one out by myself. I was pretty smart, but the second one I had to get to the university where the smart people are with PhDs. I'll be home for Christmas, but Christmas will never be the same.
Wow.
I think that kind of combination of things is what's happening. And our students are coming in as freshmen, not having been equipped by the churches. Our churches, unfortunately, in far too many of them, are more inclined toward skinny jeans and fog machines than equipping people with substance. And that's a crisis, and we're losing generations for it.
That's just, I want to let that sit there for a moment. That's powerful. And I'm hearing even from some Christian leaders, and as a pastor myself, and you've been in pastoral leadership, for those sitting in the pastor's chair, we recognize how hard it is. But I'm hearing from so many that our young people are coming out of either Christian school or youth group with kind of an inch deep faith, and they don't know the Bible well. And so that's not an indictment on anyone particularly, but something that I think we all have to think through as we're part of the church. That you're seeing the fruit of that. And so how do we address that? How do we fix that through discipleship methods? That's certainly something that I've been praying through. And I know a lot of church leaders are thinking through as well, but important to hear it from you that you have kind of a front row to this occurring. So that's the environment these students are in. What are some of maybe the challenges that you see on the campus, even if you have kids that do come from faith, they are interested in coming to a group like Ratio Christi? What are some of the challenges to helping them become thoughtful Christians?
Well, I think one is a general cultural issue. A century ago, we abdicated our role and responsibility in high culture, in the universities in particular. We lost them from 1880 to 1930. By 1930, the dust was settling. But we've become an evangelical church that emphasizes the heart of Christ and the hands of Christ, but we've disfellowshipped or excommunicated the head of Christ. And that is a disintegrated view of a Christian. We should be the integrated Christian, heart, head, and hands together. Well, our culture has become like this. We wonder how Nazi Germany emerged in the 1930s, with at the time being one of the most educated cultures on the planet. One can be formally educated and be educated into imbecility. That kind of is America right now. We have the most college degrees, but we're not learning. We're not being critical thinkers. We're adopting critical theories or other false philosophies. And if we don't bring back the life of the mind, if we don't resurrect the life of the mind and follow Jesus as he commanded, not suggested, to love God with our mind, we're never going to prepare our students for what's to come. And we've created a culture where it's just anti-intellectual, but also in the church culture where, along with everybody else, both parents are working, and it makes it very difficult then to educate your own children. So we turn that over to the youth pastor, who oftentimes, unfortunately, because I've been a youth pastor too, we're interested more in the fads and the games and the activities more than the substance. Our whole culture is into our iPhones, and we're image driven rather than logic driven. We're not thoughtful anymore. We are emotive. There are so many reasons in our culture that we're fighting against to be able to develop thoughtful Christians. And when I say thoughtful Christians, I mean a thoughtful heart where we're considerate and compassionate, but also one where we've got a thoughtful mind where we're rational and reflective. We have got to bring back the life of the mind in the church.
I've been encouraged. I was interested in getting your thoughts on this, and maybe it's just somewhat explained by the explosive growth of your ministry, and that there are a number of students that they actually welcome. They want to know about the hard questions. They want to be able to ask them. They want to think through them. They want to dig deep into the Word. They want to dig deep into philosophy and the rich Christian tradition of thinking well, right? And so I've been encouraged to see that that movement. Are you sensing that in your ministry?
Yeah, we are. A lot of people from a Christian vantage point say, look, people aren't interested in apologetics anymore, and it's in theology. We're interested in relationships and authenticity. Well, why does it have to be either or rather than both and? When I moderated a debate at Purdue University in the Elliott Hall of Music that fits 5,000, we had 4,200 people show up. I had a Democrat and a Republican senator and congressional rep on the judge panel. We had 10,000 people watching live stream from 60 countries around the world. It was one of the most packed houses at Purdue in all of their events, more than 95% of their events, which says, wow, no, people still are interested in this, and even more now so than ever. In Barna's recent research on evangelism, it was crystal clear when they asked people, what would most interest you in Christianity? Non-believers, they had 12 or 13 options to pick from. Non-believers answered almost at 50%, greater evidence to support it. And when they asked Christians, practicing Christians, not just professing Christians, what they thought non-believers would say, they picked that one dead last, which is to say that the church is out of touch with where the culture is at. And so our culture, apologetics is not just a command in Scripture, 1 Peter 3:15. It's actually back in demand in culture. And I think the reason why we've lost an entire generation called the millennials, and we're have already lost Gen Z if we don't reclaim them, it spells catastrophe for the civilization, is that we've been embarking on a culture that we've falsely diagnosed. We think we're in an Acts chapter 2 culture where you can assume a Judeo-Christian ethic, a Hebrew scriptures, God's existence. That's not where we've been for an entire generation. We've been in Acts chapter 17. And if we don't change our tactics, then there's Einstein's definition of insanity, thinking that things are going to change when we keep practicing the same old thing.
That's helpful, just having kind of a cultural foundation there. I'm fascinated by the fact that you do focus on apologetics, and I do think maybe a fair critique of some of the effort to push apologetics is, well, okay, now you're equipped to defend your faith. Great. But that's
Yeah.
not the only thing we're called to do. We're actually called to go share it. And even looking through your website, one of the things I appreciated, it's always this, well, we do apologetics, but it's to equip you to evangelize. So would you emphasize or kind of explain how you do that well?
Yeah, and that's where, the Greek philosopher Epictetus said that we have two ears and one mouth for a reason, so that we listen more. If they need a hug, we give them a hug. If they need an argument, we know how to give them an argument. But sometimes, even when it comes to one of the most prominent issues in apologetics, like the problem of evil, suffering, and pain, it might not be an intellectual obstacle for someone. It might be masked. They even may initially think it's an intellectual obstacle, but it really might be an emotional obstacle. And they may need a pastoral response, an emotional response. They may need a hug. They may need Christ to come to them in an incarnational way rather than in a rational way. If they need it rationally, then in arche and ha logos, in the beginning was the logic, and the logic was with God, and the logic was God, and became flesh and dwelt among us. Christ is logic as well as love, and we bring the logic as well as the love, but we want to diagnose the individual and the culture and make sure that we're actually responding to the person. And so we do see the value of apologetics as a tool. You can hardly do apologetics you can hardly be without apologetics today, especially on the university campus, if you're doing evangelism at all today, because the ideas have transitioned so far away from the core of Christianity or even God's existence. You can't get away with it anymore. You have to have that as a tool in your belt now.
Absolutely. So it seems to me that part of your strategy is you have the community so that they can kind of do life together, but then you're answering some of the tough questions. And so kind of getting to the heart of this, if you had to pick maybe two or three apologetics issues, no, I mean, there's everything, right? Because you're you're on a college campus dealing with all sorts of different majors, but maybe two
Yeah.
to three key issues that you're hearing about and then speaking to right now.
I mean, the classical ones are still there, the problem of evil, the biblical reliability, faith and science, evidence for God, that kind of stuff. But in the past century, it's been scientific naturalism that has controlled the universities. In the humanities, which of course the scientists thought would just die the death of a lack of oxygen, so they never paid attention to them anyway. And everybody wanted to be called a science. Even in
Mhm.
psychology, it's now the Department of Psychological Sciences or the
I see.
Department of Political Science, which was never a science. It was always part of ethics. But everyone wanted to be a science. Well, now humanities is back in with relativism. But what's emerged out of there is this new thing that has swept everybody, and it's called critical theory, that emerged originally out of the social sciences and humanities, but then jumped tracks over into the hard sciences and medicine and engineering, and now it's in the corporate world. And so I think those are the three current thought trains in the universities: scientific naturalism or scientism, critical theory and all of its manifestations, and then postmodern relativism. The classical arguments are still there, like the problem of suffering, the reliability of the Bible, science, and so forth. But it's taken on a new face as well. Now we're having to do with things dealing with race, class, sex, and gender. And anything that we dealt with that in the past has now become amplified. And the Bible is really being targeted because you've got not just homosexuality, but you've got critical queer theory. You've got not just race, but you've got critical race theory. You've got not just this issue, but this critical issue and that critical issue, where Christianity is no longer just being called dumb, but evil, wicked, heartless. So it's not just headless, but it's heartless. And so Christianity really has got to go. So we're starting back on our foundations, showing that Christianity is not just true, but now we're putting the other foot forward for credibility to show that Christianity is good. And this is where I resonate with your book on the good citizen as well.
So kind of walking through those, and just I know we don't have time to dig into all of that. Look forward to looking into some of your books and materials. But for example, like scientific naturalism, I think maybe one of the ways that has been in common culture is, well, the science says, and so everyone says that. And it used to be that God, God says, or God's word says. Now it's, well, the scientists say. And of course, the kind of response to that is, well, whose science? You see like relativism in that there is no truth, therefore you get to make your own truth. So maybe if you just like a summary response to those two, we'll then jump into some of the critical theory stuff. But what are maybe the best response, or even if it's just kind of the outline of a response to those two, the um, naturalism, scientific naturalism, and then postmodernism?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say there, but scientific naturalism is a worldview. It assumes that naturalism is true, that the universe is all that we see that it is. But that's a philosophical assertion. That needs arguments. And I really think that the arguments for God's existence are intellectually superior to arguments against it. And most atheists today, they want to call themselves atheists, but then they take the tactic of an agnostic and say, I lack sufficient belief. You need to bear the burden to prove it. No, that's agnosticism, the I don't know-ism. If you're going to be an atheist, then you bear the burden as much as the theist. That means you are required to put up arguments in favor of atheism. And frankly, to defend an absolute negative is very difficult in any area, much less, cosmologically. Recent evidence from, biochemistry or from and the DNA structure of life to the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, both weigh heavily in favor of a designer. And that's where you get someone like Anthony Flew in his book, There Is a God, How the Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Flew, in his popular level book, was the most cited atheist in philosophy of religion in a half a century. He was at the top of his game when he converted. Now, he converted to Aristotelian theism or deism rather than Christianity because he still had a problem with evil. And again, that's an argument from evil and suffering. But from my vantage point, even evil, if it's objective, if there's real evil and not just, I don't like that flavor of ice cream, a preference, then where do you get objective good and evil from? Unless you've got a moral law with which to adjudicate good from evil. And once you have a moral law, you have a moral lawmaker and you're off to the races. So for so many reasons, I think we are in a good position in philosophy of religion with respect to the arguments right now, better than we've been in any time in the past with respect to the sciences in the last century. As far as the postmodernism, once again, I try to disabuse my students of relativism on the first day of class in ethics by not going back to the old Hitler card, which is sort of passé. It's old and moldy, and people, don't get excited about it anymore. I try to use current issues with current cash value. Aristotle would call these generally accepted opinions, GAOs. Like, for example, human trafficking. Well, everybody seems to be against that except for the pimp, and he's not going to admit it publicly, right? So you've got unanimity amongst Democrats and Republicans against atheists and Christians, Buddhists and Hindus. Anti-human trafficking is something that we can commonly agree on, almost 99%. You never get anything 99% in our culture today. So I asked students, how many of you think human sex trafficking is okay? Anybody? Bueller? Nobody raises their hand. And I say, so you think that it's evil? Do you think it's preferentially evil, like how much you hate strawberry and love chocolate? Or is it absolutely evil? Evil in an objective sense, true for all people of all places and all times. They think it's objective. And I say, okay, likewise, how many of you think it's okay to take a big bat and club a homosexual over the head just for fun? Raise your hand. Anybody? Bueller? Nobody raises their hand. And I say, so you think it's objectively evil? You think it's absolutely evil? Evil for all people at all times and all places to club a homosexual over the head just for fun? Yes. Okay. So what you're telling me is you believe in the existence of a moral law. How do you have a moral law without a moral lawmaker? So quickly I've disabused them of moral relativism. And if moral relativism is false, then relativism is false, because moral relativism is a species of relativism. So there's postmodernism, deconstructionism. The deconstructionists, of course, have got to the end of their rope and realized, oh, crap. If we deconstruct everything, we'll have to deconstruct deconstructionism. And so they've tried to find some room for objective truth, and it happens to be standpoint theory or lived experience. And this is where critical theory comes in, that it looks very much relativistic, and it is to a certain extent, that knowledge is a social construction of reality, they say. Individual knowledge, gender knowledge, knowledge about mathematics, knowledge about everything. But they want to hold on to some semblance, because otherwise their view's not true. And that's how they do this, is they adopt this thing called standpoint epistemology or standpoint theory, where it's the oppressed in every given class who have access to the objective truth. But it's secret. You have to be a member of the oppressed class. And if you're a member of multiple oppressed classes, I mean, you're the perfect unicorn at that point. You've got serious moral knowledge, and you speak authoritatively. Everybody else just needs to listen, lament, and learn.
One development that I'm not sure I emphasize enough, or maybe Christians emphasize enough, is, or maybe celebrate would be a good word, some of the change there in philosophy. I think Alvin Plantinga and others may have been responsible in kind of launching that, but seeing a turn in the area of scientific naturalism, and kind of maybe there is a designer, and seeing a number of philosophers kind of head in that direction. So that certainly is encouraging. And what you mentioned there was standpoint theory, that does jump into critical race theory. And we haven't done a lot of work on that in the podcast. It's one of the things we've touched on, but you've actually given a definition for that and critiqued it a bit. Would you jump into that? Just kind of definition, and then why you think it's problematic.
Gosh, and the definition is difficult. I have done that, and I would have a quote up here. I don't have the book right in front of me from one of their own sources. But it's easier to characterize it than to define it, because it seems sometimes to be a moving target. And so the way to do this, as a philosopher, we think about the three major branches of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, or in layman's terms, reality, theories of knowledge, and right and wrong. So we ask, what is real? How do we know what is real? How should we then live based on what we know about reality? That's philosophy. So if we think about critical theory, critical race theory just being a subset of critical theory, all of the critical theories operate on these same premises. What's their view of human relations? Human relations are divided up into social binaries that are juxtaposed in animosity and in enmity one toward another, in terms of oppressed groups, the haves and the have-nots, the victims and the victimizers. Everyone is part of one of those groups. Are you an individual? If you are, that takes hindsight. It's not really important, the hindmost place. What matters is your identity with your group, and group identity is everything, and everything is about power and privilege, and this is where identity politics comes in. And so, for listeners thinking about this, if they've heard of social justice, critical theory, neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism, identity politics, those are like throwing socks on a wall. If one of those stick, that you're probably in the ballpark. So human relations, your oppressor and oppressed groups. This is the goal, to identify oppressor and oppressed groups. This is where DIE stems from: diversity, inclusivity, equity. What they mean by it is diversity is you identify oppressor and oppressed groups. The second one comes in terms of the inclusivity, which is right in tandem with the theories of knowledge. And that is, well, how do we know what is right and wrong? And how do we know what is truly oppressed and not? Well, you know it by lived experience. You listen to people's stories, and they will tell you about how they have been treated in this way or that way, and it's always anecdotal. It's never statistical data, but the inclusivity is to then assess blame against the oppressor classes and include in the victimized classes those particular group dynamics. So you get blacks, women, LGBT, and there are layers of that too. You've got brown privilege that isn't, is more privileged than blacks, for example. White privilege more than brown. And homosexual is one thing, but transgender yet another. Now, if you've got, again, multiple layers of these groups, let's say you're a black lesbian female. I mean, you've got three intersectional elements coming together. You've got some serious moral knowledge from which to speak, and everybody needs to listen, learn, and lament. And then finally, the ethics. So what's the end goal then? That is DIE. So this is equity. This is righting the wrongs. This is payback. This is reparations. This is coercively redistributing the wealth. In classical Marxism, we would talk about it in terms of, someone's got 6 pieces of the pie, you have 4 pieces. There's a zero-sum game here. The pie never grows. You got 6 pieces, I got 4 because you stole that somehow. Anytime there is inequality in anything in terms of groups, it entails injustice. Those two words are simply synonymous. Inequality entails injustice. And so the ultimate goal then is social justice, or rectifying the inequalities in the groups. And it's about equal outcome, not equality of opportunity. We don't think about people being equal in terms of being made in God's image and having intrinsic dignity. It's just equal in terms of race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, nationality, and so forth.
So two follow-up questions. Thank you. That was very, very helpful. One is, could you give us a quick biblical critique kind of along those 3 lines? And then the second kind of follow-up question, and I can kind of throw it back to you if you finish up, but how do we as Christians understand what would be a kind of faithful and honest teaching of history? I just listened to a podcast on the transatlantic slave trade and the horrors of that. So understanding, having a full orbed understanding of history and human sin and evil, and even in our own history, versus kind of, because of what happened in the past, just completely shifting over to what would be an unbiblical idea. So first one, kind of biblical critique, and then second, how do we parse what is like history versus critical race theory?
Yeah, so biblical critique in terms of human relations, there are only 2 kinds of people in the Bible. It's not oppressor and oppressed, it's sinner and saint. Those who are resisting God and those who have responded to God. In terms of our relations, human relations, we're all the same at the foot of the cross. We are all created in God's image, and for that reason, Black lives matter, because Black lives are sacred, because everyone's life is sacred, and we should be treating everyone equally with respect and love and dignity. In terms of knowledge, well, we believe that the Bible offers knowledge and the ultimate lens through which to view the general life. And so the Bible is special revelation. That out there is general revelation. But if you've got God, who is the author of both Scripture and nature, God's word and God's works, there should never be a contradiction with respect to the facts themselves. The contradiction will be at the level of the interpretation of the facts, be it science or theology, right? So we have Scripture, we have nature, we believe that truth is real, it is objective, we can know it, but Scripture helps us to more clearly see things, especially when we're talking about history, because now we're looking at it from a theological standpoint and not just an anthropological standpoint. And then when it comes to ethics, look, the ultimate problem, Josh, is sin And the ultimate solution is Jesus's redemption and God's redemptive plan in history, history itself, meaning his story. I think the second thing was about history. I forget.
That's right. Yeah. So kind of how, because in my experience, and we've been doing some work on trying to connect pastors, kind of a multi-ethnic pastors fellowship. And sometimes whenever you talk about ethnic unity, which is a beautiful biblical concept, or you speak anything about the history of the United States that includes slavery, and I would say about the United States that our history is at times magnificent. You have the Declaration of Independence, but at times monstrous with some of the things that happen in the American South.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the doctrine of sin actually helps us square that up in the sense that we can be both monsters and magnificent. But whenever you speak about history, those on the conservative side, it's like immediately, oh, you're just peddling CRT. So I think we need to have a pretty clear distinction in between, all right, what is an unbiblical concept, and then what is a kind of faithful teaching of history?
Right. And for what it's worth, prior to COVID hitting, I was attending an all-black church. My family was the only white family there, and with the pastor, he and I had done works in racial reconciliation on campus among faculty, 5-6 years ago, before this whole thing went south. Anyway, believing that the Christian idea is that we should have racial reconciliation. We should acknowledge human shortfalls and problems in our past as well. But when it comes to critical race theory, that's not just race theory. That's critical theory with race. And critical theory is Marxism, which Marx taught and got from the devil. And this is poison to racial relations. It's poison to gender relations. It's poison to everybody because it's about dividing and conquering. You'll never find in any of the critical theories, much less critical race theory, anything other than justice or social justice, as it were. You never find things like forgiveness. You never find grace. And you never find equality of voices. You only get voices that matter, being those who are in an oppressed class. And if some member of an oppressed class, be it black, disagrees with the narrative, or be it woman, disagrees with the narrative, or be it poor person, and disagrees with the socialist narrative, well, they're said to be someone that doesn't, they've still got an intellectual deficiency. They've got, they're still under the spell of privileged. They don't have liberational consciousness yet. We used to call them Uncle Toms, I guess would be the term. No longer is that the term. There's no coming together in those things. It's payback, it's animosity. Some of those people who lead those movements say that, and my pastor and I talked about this together. They say that race never goes away. It just remanifests in another way. And they said that's even the case in interracial marriages. So how are you going to be in an interracial marriage and know that one of you is always a racist? And it's just a matter of how it's manifesting itself. How am I going to be in a church setting and attending the church? And I talked to my pastor about this. If this book by Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi on how to be an anti-racist start to become adopted by people in the congregation, how can I even attend the church anymore? Because they're always going to be thinking, I've got an agenda. I'm trying to virtue signal or something like that. And I'm always going to be wondering what they're thinking about me. And I can't get to know them as people anymore. I can't love them as brothers and sisters anymore. I'm always trying to understand this power dynamic between us and how it's always present and never going away. And there's never forgiveness. That's not the gospel. That's anti-gospel. And so I think we need to come to grips with, listening. And again, 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we listen more and we think about history and we think about disparaging facts if they're part of the law currently or part of human treatment currently. But it's the Christian gospel that makes sense of why we ought to be treating others with respect because their lives are sacred. We ought to be open to that. But at the same time, we need to beware of false philosophy, Paul talks about. But you can't be aware of false philosophy if you're not aware of it. And most Christians just don't want to engage in philosophy, period. But we're certainly willing to adopt it uncritically. We don't train in critical thinking, but we adopt critical theory. It's in our churches, it's in our seminaries, it's in our campus ministries, and it's in every flora and fauna of the Christian faith. The barbarians are no longer just at the gates, they're in the citadels, and this is a major crisis in the church right now.
And I appreciate you spending so much time on this. And I know we have gone on about it, but I'm mindful that when you were mentioning apologetics, because I think a lot of Christians would say, okay, here's my central gospel witness. All right, I'm just going to tell people about Jesus. But what I think you're sensing, I'm certainly sensing as well, is that people will entirely discount the Bible, will entirely discount the message of Jesus because these other theories are teaching them that the Bible can't be trusted or it's even hateful. And so this is the issue of our day. And when I think about kind of critical theory, my greatest concern is kind of where are we headed? So as a church, are we seeing each other as fellow image bearers? Certainly lived experience is valuable, but again, my authority, hopefully when I'm speaking, is not Josh, rather it's the word of God that is objectively true for all people. But I think of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He says that the United States was dedicated to the proposition that all men, all humans are created equal. And is that the vision that we're still heading towards, or is it towards just greater division? So,
Yeah, I mean, even if I had the page on an introduction to critical race theory on page 2 and 3, the authors who have been with critical race theory since the beginning, 1989, at the same time as the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Tiananmen Square, and yet Marxism wasn't dead. It emerged its head in the U.S. in major ways. On pages 2 and 3, where they work at defining it, they are seriously about the repudiation of the civil rights era. When Martin Luther King comes out and says something like, I have a dream that one day my children will not be judged based on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. He gets chastised now because he didn't take it far enough. We need to focus on the skin color and primarily on the skin color. Your group dynamic does not include character. It includes skin and body parts. And so, in the 1960s, you have pictures you can Google where, we were dealing with our racist past and so forth. And men were walking in picket lines saying, I am a man. I am a man. And some of the leading critical race theorists came along at that time who coined intersectionality and so forth and said, no, you are a black man. We need to no longer be colorblind, MLK. We need to be obsessed with color. So I don't think we should ignore color as Christians. We should not ignore problems if they're there with respect to the sexes and so forth. But we should not be obsessed with them as though those superficial elements are the core elements themselves.
and again, just resting back for those listening on the authority of Scripture, that again, we're made in God's image. And if we're going to flourish and have true unity in a society, that those would be the things that we would focus on. And so this has kind of been a primer, perhaps those that maybe have not learned a lot about CRT, certainly more resources on the Ratio Christi website, as well as some of the books that you've written. So
Yeah,
kind of
if I could
go ahead,
there,
please. Yeah.
For that topic, we have a number of booklets that are either digital or printable, and they're free for download if you just go ratiochristi.org and go publications. One of them is on on engaging the social justice and critical theory movement from a Christian standpoint. All of these booklets are written by mostly PhDs, but they're written at the 11th grade reading level, and they're approximately, the size of 3 blog articles. And so that one's been downloaded 10,000 times.
Wow.
UNC scholar and UC Berkeley scholar wrote that one. Another one is God evil? What about the parts of the Old Testament? Is the Bible reliable? Faith and science. We've got one coming out in the next probably 3 weeks by a black author who's a doctorate. Is Christianity a white man's religion? Based on his book on the topic. We've got another one coming out shortly on LGBT by a former lesbian who has lived experience, so to speak. So people can get access for free to all of these booklets that touch on these topics. In the next 3 months, we'll have about 30 of these booklets on every conceivable topic, from economics, race, class, sex, gender, to the problem of science, of evil and suffering, biblical reliability. And one final point on what you were saying about the Bible. The problem is if we not only are sensitive to racial issues from a Christian standpoint, but if we adopt critical race theory, which by definition is critical theory plus race, it's Marxism, they despise meta-narratives. And the Bible is the greatest meta-narrative. And out of that meta-narrative comes the patriarchy, comes heteronormativity, comes racial issues, comes this issue, that issue, every conceivable issue. And God is the ultimate oppressor. So any Christian church that starts to dive into critical race theory, they may not see what's going on, but it's going to be like the frog in the kettle. And they're going to start imbibing certain false philosophies. And before long, they have become liberation theology, which is not Christian.
There's so much there, and we appreciate you giving us the primer there. And we'll certainly link to the website and to those resources. I'm actually looking forward to reading the one that you mentioned. So, with the idea of being good citizens, and you've given us so much to think about, and I'm blessed that God has kind of expanded your coast through ministries now international. One of the questions I often get from pastors, and even I think through myself, is when, in a sense, do you defer to university leadership and or those that are in authority at the institution when they may be coming after an organization for preaching or speaking the truth? Certainly you've shared some of your own personal experiences, but when do you make the decision to defer to them versus when do you make the decision to go ahead and say, nope, it's time to stand, let's call the lawyer?
Yeah, that's a good question. We are very patient when it comes to sorry about that. We're very patient when it comes to some of these. Oh my goodness, sorry.
Might be the lawyer calling. Who knows?
Yeah, right. Our receptionist is apparently not in right now. We're very sensitive to some of these issues, and in a couple of the federal court cases, for example, we have given 2 years to try to work with them to get them to right the wrong, to treat us equally. All we want is equal treatment. Forget the fact that we Christians were the ones that founded the universities, beginning from Harvard in 1636. For the first 200 years, they were all Protestant and core Christian orthodoxy. We just want equal treatment. And so eventually, if we can't get that through discussion and being good citizens and trying to work patiently and rationally, then we have to give them continuing education and bring forth this few-page parchment called the U.S. Constitution, and we win every time with that one. In our recent one, we're facing a possible first loss, but that's because the president has weighed in with executive privilege on it. But I see no point in why Christians don't choose at some point to litigate for our rights as, say, Roman citizens like Paul did. Litigate for our rights as Christians to be able to get the gospel across. We're not trying to be haters on people. We're not trying to force people. We're asking people questions. Our approach is so dialogue oriented, so friendly. I even had one atheist contact me and asked me if he could be the student president of his club, because he's the longest standing member of the club. And he says, I wouldn't change a thing about it. I love what Ratio Christi is doing, but they're looking for officers right now, and I'm the longest member. Can you make a modification for me? We have good relationships on campus, but we're being charged with discriminating simply because we hold to historically Christian beliefs, like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton did.
Well, and that's helpful. And it comes back to kind of our final step in being a good citizen, which is sometimes you have to do the hard work. You build the relationships, but like you said, the Apostle Paul, he used his civitas. That's helpful. Just as pastors are trying to walk through this, you build those relationships. But if they're coming after your kind of central ability to share your message, or the fact that you're going to define yourself as a Christian organization, being a Christian organization, then there are laws and there's the Constitution there. Well, I want to say thanks for your time. I know we had kind of that extended conversation about critical race theory. That was very helpful. I'm already thinking through that, looking forward to more resources there. But if you had a billboard on which you could put a message to the gospel preaching church, just any idea about citizenship or preaching the gospel right now, what would that be?
Well, I think we need to think strategically about the gospel, and the university is the most influential institution in civilization. As goes the university, so goes the culture. As goes the U.S. university, so goes the world. Wow. We need to be strategically thinking about the university as part of every ministry's vocation. We're losing generations to this, and we could be winning the world through this. It literally is the 1040 window of the Western world. It's the if we despise and omit our attention to the university, I think it's one of the greatest omissions of the Great Commission.
Again, just going to let that sit there for a moment, because I do see many Christians kind of running for the hills, and it's certainly a fan of Christian education, but if we're completely abdicating our presence in these places. And I did note, and maybe for a future conversation, would love to know more about, because you have the ministry to students, but also to professors as well. I see that as a critical part. But I appreciate that encouragement that we should be salt and light in every space. And if you want to be strategic, we're losing 75% of our kids, when they go to college. What an important place to minister. So appreciate your work there and all that you're doing all around the world, and look forward to future conversations with you.
Thank you. You too, Josh.